Continued from previous screencast. Middle-class Afro-Caribbean Chinese and non-Muslim Asian girls all aspire to gain secure employment combined with marriage, whereas Muslim Asian women tend to become unemployed when they marry. This determines whether they will succeed in education. Most research has focused on Black and Asian family structures as possible causes of underachievement. However, as we saw earlier, white working-class pupils underachieve and have lower aspirations. For example, a survey of state schools for the Sutton Trust found that 80% of 11 to 16-year-old ethnic minority pupils aspire to go to university, as against only 68% of white pupils. This lower level of aspiration and achievement may be the result of a lack of parental support. For example, Lupton studied 4 mainly working-class schools, 2 predominantly white, 1 serving a large Pakistani community, and the 4th drawing pupils from an ethnically mixed community. She found that teachers reported poorer levels of behaviour and discipline in the white working-class schools, despite the fact that they had fewer children on free school meals, a common measure of poverty among pupils. Teachers blame this on lower levels of parental support and the negative attitude that white working-class parents had towards education. By contrast, ethnic minority parents were more likely to see education as a way up in society. Similarly, Gillian Evans argues that street culture in white working-class areas can be brutal, and so young people have to learn how to withstand intimidation and intimidate others. In this context, school can become a place where the power games that young people engage in on the streets are played out again, bringing disruption and making it harder for pupils to succeed. The effects of white working-class families can be used to evaluate the cultural deprivation theories which concentrate on ethnic underachievement relating to blacks and Asians. It is also an interesting evaluation of Sewell's study, which argues that street culture seems to be a predominantly black domain. As we're looking at class, we've looked at educational policy, which seeks to overcome the problems caused by cultural deprivation, and this is compensatory education. So the compensatory education, when we looked at class, also applies here. So compensatory education such as Operation Head Start and Sure Start and Education Action Zones. There have also been some policies which have been aimed to tackle specifically cultural deprivation amongst ethnic minorities. Some of these include schemes on parenting skills, homework and breakfast clubs, which were part of educational action zones, help for voluntary Saturday schools in the black community, which was a key part of the late 1990s and early 2000s, and funding of English as an additional language. Cultural deprivation theory has been criticised for ignoring the positive effects of ethnicity and achievement. The family structures and parental aspirations of many ethnic minority groups help, not hinder, educational progress. The next part of the screencast, which looks at cultural factors, will be looking at some of these arguments, and this can be used to criticise cultural deprivation theory. Don't forget as well some of the criticisms of class and cultural deprivation theory, particularly Laboff, who looked at black speech, will be useful here in criticising ethnicity and cultural deprivation. Keddy sees cultural deprivation as a victim-blaming explanation. She argues that ethnic minority children are culturally different, not culturally deprived. They underachieve because schools are ethnocentric. They're biased in favour of white culture, and they're against minorities. Critics oppose compensatory education because they see it as an attempt to impose the dominant white culture on children who already have a coherent culture of their own. Some sociologists argue that material deprivation rather than cultural deprivation is the main cause of underachievement. We will examine material deprivation after we look at cultural factors. And remember, material deprivation may impact on cultural deprivation. Errol Lawrence argued that black people underachieve in education because of racism. Rutter argues that parents assisted children with schoolwork and actually did show concern, but because they had to work long hours, they did not always have the time. This is an example of how material factors may intersect with cultural factors. As previously, I've split cultural factors and cultural deprivation up into two distinct areas. It could be argued that Ken Price is actually a cultural deprivation theorist. Ken Price sees family structure as contributing to the underachievement of black Caribbean pupils in Britain. From a comparison of black and Asian pupils, he claims that Asians are higher achievers because their culture is more resistant to racism and gives them a greater sense of self-worth. By contrast, he argues black Caribbean culture is less cohesive and less resistant to racism. As a result, many black pupils have low self-esteem and underachieve. Price argues that the difference is the result of the differing impacts of the colonialism on the two groups. He argued that the experience of slavery was culturally devastating for blacks. Being transported and sold into slavery meant that they lost their language, religion, and entire family system. By contrast, Asian family structures, languages, and religions were not destroyed by colonial rule. It could be argued that Price is a cultural deprivation theorist because he argues that black people's culture is weak. However, he doesn't really blame black parents and pupils for this loss of culture. He blames colonialism. Bourdieu argues the education system is not neutral because the culture of school is white culture. Ethnic minority groups lack cultural capital and consequently have less opportunity to attain high success in later life. Again, you will need to use your knowledge of cultural capital from the class section if you needed to expand on this in an essay. Mack and Gale conducted a study in a sixth form college in the Midland City between 1986 and 1988 using observation and interviews. He found that most pupils saw their parents as a major reason for their success in education. Mack and Gale says the students explicitly identified with their parents, seeing them as their main support and source of inspiration. This contradicts the claims of some sociologists that parental culture holds back some members of minority ethnic groups in the education system. However, a few of the girls did believe their gender was a handicap at home. They were expected to do much more domestic work than their brothers, leaving them less time for their studies. Ruth Lupton argues that adult authority in Asian families is similar to the model that operates in schools. She found that respectful behaviour towards adults was expected from children. This had a knock-on effect at school since parents were much more likely to be supportive of school behaviour policies. Driver and Ballard also argue that Asian family structures bring educational benefits. Asian parents have more positive attitudes towards education and higher aspirations for their children's future, and as a result are more positive. Jeffrey Driver argues that black Caribbean families, far from being dysfunctional, provides girls with positive role models of strong independent women. Driver argues this is why black girls tend to be more successful in the education system than black boys. Material deprivation means a lack of those physical necessities that are seen as essential or normal for life in today's society. In general, working-class people are more likely to face poverty and material deprivation. Material deprivation explanations see educational failure as resulting from factors such as substandard housing and low income. Ethnic minorities are more likely to face these problems. For example, according to Flatty, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are 3 times more likely than whites to be in the poorest fifth of the population. Unemployment is 3 times higher for African and Bangladeshi Pakistani people than for whites. 15% of ethnic minority households live in overcrowded conditions, compared with only 2% of white households. Pakistanis are nearly twice as likely to be in unskilled or semi-skilled jobs compared to whites. Ethnic minority workers are more likely to be engaged in shift work. Bangladeshi and Pakistani women are more likely to be engaged in low-paid home working, sometimes for as little as £1.50 per hour. Inequalities reflect differences in the proportion of children from different ethnic groups who are eligible for free school meals. Here is the table showing the proportion of each ethnic group who are eligible for free school meals. Free school meals is taken as an indicator to show poverty as it is linked to income. The inequalities parallel those seen in educational achievement. For example, Indians and whites generally have a higher social class position than Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, who often face high levels of poverty. The material deprivation explanation argues that such class differences explain why Bangladeshis and Pakistani pupils tend to do worse than Indian and white pupils. Evidence for this view comes from the Swan Report, 1985, which estimated that social class accounts for at least 50% of the difference in achievement between ethnic groups. If we fail to take the different class positions of ethnic groups into account when we compare their educational achievements, there is a danger that we may overestimate the effects of cultural deprivation and underestimate the effects of poverty and material deprivation. For example, Pilkington found that African Caribbean families have a high level of lone parenthood, which creates financial difficulties. This goes against Murray's viewpoint that lone parents are unable to discipline their children and create children with lower values. However, Gilbert and Mertz argue that social class factors do not override the influence of ethnicity. When we compare pupils of the same social class but different ethnic origins, we still find differences in achievement. This is particularly the case for black children, since even middle-class pupils do comparatively poorly at GCSE. While material deprivation and poverty has an impact on the educational achievement of some ethnic minority children, some sociologists argue that poverty is itself the product of another factor, which is racism. As David Mason puts it, discrimination is a continuing and persistent feature of the experience of Britain's citizens of minority ethnic origin. John Rex shows how racial discrimination leads to social exclusion and how this worsens the poverty faced by ethnic minorities. In housing, for instance, discrimination means that minorities are more likely to be forced into substandard accommodation than white people of the same class. In employment, there is evidence of direct and deliberate discrimination. Mike Noon sent identical pairs of letters about future employment opportunities to the top 100 UK companies, signed by fictitious applicants called Evans and Patel with the same qualifications and experience. In terms of both the number and the helpfulness of replies, the companies were more encouraging to the white candidates. This helps to explain why members of ethnic minorities are more likely to face unemployment and low pay, and this in turn has a negative effect on their children's educational prospects. So what we are looking at here is wider racism in society contributes to material deprivation, which affects their general class position. Next, we are going to examine internal factors. And when we look at internal factors, we can broadly group this into three main things: labelling and teacher racism, anti-school subcultures and pupil responses, and the ethnocentric curriculum and marketisation selection policies.